Welcome everybody to the first in our series of events for the Canadian Marxist University. It's fantastic to see so many people here today interested in talking about what is Marxism. My name is Renu. I'm a member of Fight Back, the organization that is putting on this university all through the fall. We are part of an international revolutionary organization, the International Marxist Tendency, and here we are building the forces of Marxism in Canada. Capitalism is in utter crisis, politically, socially, economically. Revolution is on the agenda, and these movements that we're seeing around the world will come to Canada sooner than later, I think, and we need to prepare. That is why we're hosting this Marxist University. We need to study the lessons of the past, understand Marxist theory, and build a Marxist organization to prepare to overthrow this rotten system. So I encourage everybody to get involved in the struggle for socialism. And one of the best ways to do that is to join and attend events like this, but also to check out our Marxist magazine that we publish. So the Marxist magazine goes out on a monthly basis. So for $20, you can get an issue sent to your email every single month for a whole year. So I highly encourage everyone to check that out. A link to subscribe is going to be posted in the chat. You can also visit our website, marxist.ca, and on the right-hand panel, you'll see an option to subscribe. So a part of spreading the word on socialism is building on campuses all across the country. We've already done a lot of that work and we want to spread that further. So I'd like to ask everyone to update their name and include what campus you're on if you're on a campus. And if not, you can put your occupation if you like, and don't worry about it if you don't want to, but I'll let everyone do that. So update your name with whatever campus you're on. That would be great. So for today's event, Hermes will be presenting. He will present for about 30 minutes on what is Marxism. He'll introduce everybody to it. And then we will go into the discussion. And then finally, Hermes will conclude at the very end. And so with that, I will pass it on to Hermes and I'll let him go into the presentation. Just want to make sure he's not muted here.
Thank you, Renu. A world on fire, global revolt, and an epoch of world revolution. This is how the history books will remember the period in which we are living in today. That this economic and political crisis that is evident in each and every last country has pushed entire populations out into the streets of their cities. No continent has been spared from this organic rage and frustration over the miserable conditions of life for the billions of people across the world. And consider this, the people who brought society to this point, the bankers, the capitalists, their political stooges in the parliaments, for decades they said that revolution was ruled out, that it was impossible and utopian even to expect ordinary working people to take their destiny into their own hands. Well, I suppose it's no surprise that those very people that have brought us to such a precarious global situation have been proven decidedly wrong. That people have moved and everyone has noticed. I mean, a few examples, just recall what has occurred in the last few years in France, in Greece, in Egypt, in Tunisia, again, just last year, what we saw in Chile, in Ecuador, in Hong Kong, in Lebanon, in Bangladesh, in India. And then again, most recently, and in my opinion, most notably, just this year, in the United States of America, with the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, this time with insurrectionary characteristics. Millions of people have come out challenging the racist and exploitative capitalist system. And importantly, they're looking for an alternative, a way out of this dead-end system. But what we can observe from these energetic and heroic movements is that it isn't simply enough to come out onto the streets and be against capitalism, against austerity, against unemployment, and so on. That the energy and enthusiasm in itself is not sufficient. The Greek, the Egyptian, and even the Lebanese masses show us this very clearly. In Greece, they had something like 40 general strikes. The Egyptian masses toppled 2 governments. In Lebanon, another 2. That there's clearly an appetite for revolution. And also the energy is present. What is missing, however, is perspectives for what to replace capitalism with. And this is what is missing ultimately. What is missing are revolutionary ideas. What is missing in these movements is a leadership that knows how to win the revolution. And this is where we would argue that Marxism comes in. Because in short, Marxism can be described as the science of revolution. Now, in the duration of this presentation, I hope to briefly outline the most important aspects of Marxism. But before we dive into that, I think it is also worth taking a look briefly at how Marxism is treated in the mainstream media. That in fact, you can tell a lot about an idea based on how its opponents treat it. But it really shouldn't come as a surprise to most people here that the unprecedented revolutionary movements, which I've outlined above, have coincided with a blatant and all out attack on the ideas of Marxism. Now, obviously, Marxists are well acquainted with all manner of abuse, lies, distortion, and outright slander against our ideas. This isn't new to us either. Actually, Karl Marx himself reflected on this in the Communist Manifesto, where he said the following, and I quote, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. Where is the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries?" Can anyone argue that this isn't the situation we find ourselves in today? I mean, a textbook example is our neighbors down south. The Republicans accuse the Democrats of communism. The Democrats accuse Sanders of communism. The Sanders campaign then blames communists for its electoral defeat. The BLM movement is a Marxist movement. Feminism is Marxism. The universities are Marxist. Justin Trudeau is a Marxist. Jeremy Corbyn is a Marxist. Wearing a mask to prevent the spread of a deadly pandemic is also today Marxism. That in short, it has become popular to label anything somebody dislikes as Marxism. And so, of course, there's also the Red Scare and anti-Soviet Union propaganda being regurgitated once again by professors and students alike. Now, the Soviet Union was by no means a perfect society, and Marxists strongly condemned the mismanagement and authoritarianism of the regime in the Soviet Union. But our anti-communist friends admit the fact that capitalism in Russia has been a hell of a lot worse for the Russian people. The Moscow Times, in fact, actually published in March of 2020, just a few months ago, a poll which stated that 75% of Russians think that the Soviet era was the best time in their country's history. The survey noted that that the people were essentially nostalgic of what they called a future stability and confidence. They said they associated with a good life in our country. Now, you have to note that that these feelings, they come in spite of the monstrous bureaucratic caricature of Marxism that existed in the Soviet Union. That we make no mistake, and we do not apologize for the crimes of Stalinism. But the question of whether Soviet Union was a socialist country or not is a whole separate discussion for which we actually have dedicated an entire lecture in the Marxist University. That will be taking place on Thursday, October 22nd at 7 p.m. So again, if you're not registered yet, make sure you register to the Marxist University because there's going to be a hell of a lot of stuff that you can catch in these discussions. But the key takeaway here that I'm trying to make is essentially that capitalism has created such miserable conditions of life for workers around the world that no amount of anti-Marxist propaganda is having the desired effect. That in reality, the opposite is taking place. More and more are moving towards revolutionary conclusions. And really, there's no reason to believe that this is by any means only a Russian phenomenon. In fact, I believe that such a mood is on the rise in every country on the planet. So in short, what we're witnessing is an epoch of revolution, revolutionary upheavals, coinciding with a dramatic increase in the interest for socialist ideas. And so at a time when everyone and their dog is a Marxist, I think it is vital that we study the true ideas of Marxism. We understand the current world situation through this lens, and only then do I believe that we will be able to play a positive role in the unfolding movements and ultimately lead the working class to victory. So without further ado, let's get right into it. That the study of Marxism can be approached easiest by systematically studying its three main pillars. and that is the Marxist view of history, Marxist economics, and Marxist philosophy. Now, I will only briefly discuss each here today. To further flesh these ideas out is precisely the purpose of the Marxist University this fall. So, for the next 2 months, we'll be, taking on all manner of subjects, including these three key pillars. So today it can really be seen as a brief introduction to these ideas. But of course, there's also no substitute for reading. So please check out our bookstore that we have a wide variety of books ranging from the classics of Marxism to modern texts, taking up Marxism in the 21st century. And so pick up those books, pick up these classics of Marxism, join a reading group, discuss with us, because ultimately that is the best way to learn and have these ideas sink in as your own method. But really, to return to the subject at hand, I would like to start by describing the Marxist view of history. Now, you see, Marx is often referred to as a philosopher or an economist, but his contributions to the study of history are regularly omitted. But in fact, one of his greatest contributions to human knowledge was in the field of history, as it was Marx who was the first person to place our understanding of history on a scientific basis. He was the first to uncover the laws that shape the course of history through its progression, its retrogression, through the ebbs and flows. And this approach to understanding history today we call the materialist conception of history, or in a different way, historical materialism. And really, it starts with a very simple premise, and that is that history can indeed be understood. And you'll be surprised by how many people disagree with even that. Henry Ford, for example, is reported to have said that history is bunk and that it is just one damn thing after another. These are Henry Ford's words. Now, the same idea is expressed today, slightly more elegantly, you could say, by the supporters of postmodernism, which is unfortunately being regarded by some people today as a valid philosophy. Again, this is a very unfortunate fact. Now, these people claim that there can be no talk of progress, that history cannot really be understood as having laws, that no fundamental laws guide this development of human history, and then again, finally, that it cannot be understood. But if we accept the fact that laws exist in all other fields of science, in chemistry, biology, physics, then it only reasons that these laws should extend to human history as well in the social sciences. But this postmodern denial of progress in history is not only wrong, but it is also characteristic of the psychology of the intellectuals of the bourgeoisie in the phase of capitalist decline. That it is a reflection ultimately of the fact that under capitalism, progress has indeed reached its limits, and capitalism threatens to take society into reverse. Now, obviously, these postmodernists don't admit this fact, and instead they choose to deny progress altogether. Now, we've actually dedicated an entire session to the question of postmodernism, and that will be on Thursday, September 24th, again at 7 p.m. So again, mark your calendars and make sure you tune into that as well. However, for our purposes today, it is enough to say that Marxists do not approach history in this eclectic manner of the postmodernists. The basic premise of historical materialism is that the ultimate source of human development is the development of the productive forces. This means the development of the tools, machinery, industry, and technology through which we achieve the means of life. Now, this is actually the most important conclusion drawn by Marx because this alone can permit us to arrive at a scientific conception of history. That, in short, what Marx said is that what gives a system its place in history is its ability to raise the standard of living better than the system which came before it. In other words, a socioeconomic system can only last insofar as it can develop society forward. Now, as soon as it cannot do that, society enters a period of social and political crisis that either ends in the establishment of a new system through revolutionary upheavals, or if the revolutions prove unsuccessful, it ends in the ruin of society. And yes, when we speak of progress, we do not assert that human history is an uninterrupted line towards progress. That along with this line of ascent, there's also a line of descent. There have been periods in history when, for different reasons, society has been thrown back, progress interrupted, and civilization and culture undermined. This was actually the case in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire, in the period at least known in English as the Dark Ages, that for 1,000 years, over 1,000 years, Europe entered into a deep sleep. Civilization was thrown back by a millennium. But obviously, over the centuries, society slowly regrouped and there emerged a new system, feudalism, as we call it. But as we know, feudalism, the feudal system, was a very unproductive system. It developed the productive forces of society only very slowly. That in Europe during the Middle Ages, take for example the fact that the best roads were built by the Romans 1,000 years ago. They forgot how to build roads in Europe. They forgot how to make bricks under feudalism, really. So this feudal society, culturally stagnant, religiously suffocated, isolated in small communities without much interaction, which imposed heavy taxes on trade and commerce, proved to be a gigantic barrier to the development of industry and thus the development of the productive forces. That in the 17th and 18th centuries, this emerging capitalist class of traders, merchants, manufacturers, craftsmen, etc., began to come into conflict, direct conflict with the feudal system. That, in other words, feudalism was proving to be a barrier to the development of capitalism and the conditions of human life. Feudalism had to be done away with, and so it was. But how was that accomplished, by the way? Not by any friendly negotiation between the capitalist and the feudal lord. No, but by a series of convulsive uprisings which forcibly overthrew the old order and paved the way for the revolutionary development of capitalism. Revolutions erupted in Great Britain, in America, and of course, the Great French Revolution that everybody is well acquainted with. And in their time, these revolutions were incredibly progressive and justified. But again, in their time, capitalism was an enormously progressive force, but in its youth. Its ability to raise the productive forces in society out of this feudal impasse was something Marx spoke about quite repeatedly in his works. And here again, we see that Marx never viewed history in any moralistic way, but in a scientific way. But again, Marx obviously didn't leave it at that either. After all, it's called the Communist Manifesto, not the Capitalist Manifesto. That despite acknowledging that capitalism sure played a progressive role in its youth, Marx also explained that the system had within it built-in contradictions that would at a later stage undermine the system and turn it into a barrier to the further development of society. So on the basis of this revolutionary and scientific understanding of history, Marx then set out to understand the internal dynamics of the capitalist economy, to understand how it would develop and ultimately what would replace it. Now this brings us to Marx's economic ideas. But you see, to understand the capitalism around us today, why it is such a reactionary, regressive system that is pulling society backwards, it is first necessary to analyze what it was exactly that made capitalism revolutionary in its heyday. Now you see, what was really revolutionary about the capitalist mode of production was its continual drive to reinvest profits into new technologies, new fields of industry, and so on. And in doing so, rapidly developing the productive forces. This was night and day compared with the feudal system, which was an incredibly unproductive system, to say again. But now, can anyone argue that the capitalist system is able to do this today? Far from it. Today, the capitalists refuse to invest, that they would rather hoard their wealth. Like simply take a look, for example, at the figures on wealth inequality in the world today. In the States, for example, 3 men own in America as much as the bottom 50% of its population. Now, again, this was a pre-COVID statistic. Since COVID, wealth polarization has only increased. You can look at the figures. Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, all these men have actually dramatically increased their wealth. But that's not it. That even on a world scale, again, this is a pre-COVID statistic, that 8 men globally owned as much as the bottom 50% of the world's poorest population. That's 3.5 billion people. 8 men own as much wealth as them. So again, despite the fact that capitalists used to be innovators, pushing humanity to new frontiers, developing the mode of production, it is clear that now they're nothing more than giant parasites dragging the rest of society down with them. But why is that? Then why is it that capitalism ceased to be able to develop the productive forces? Now, you see, this question was ultimately left to Marx to answer. And his answer to this is today known as the labor theory of value. And simply put, it states that labor is the source of all value. And again, shouldn't be controversial to most working class people. But even before Marx, actually, it was already determined by these bourgeois economists, these capitalist economists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, who are regarded as the fathers of capitalism. Even they regarded that labor was the source of all value. That Marx simply took this discovery to its logical conclusion. Under capitalism, Marx observed, workers were paid poverty wages, far below the value they generated for their employer. But now when this employer invests back this great surplus extracted from the labor of workers, this profit, into new commodities, into new production, eventually the capitalist realizes that the working class, being kept on these poverty wages, is simply unable to buy back the goods that exist on the market. And herein lies the source of capitalist crisis. Herein lies the basic understanding of Marxist economics. That every 10 years or so, the market reaches its natural limits, that the buying power of the working class hits a limit and the system enters into crisis. That in short, in these crises, production is shut down, factories are closed, workers are laid off, and living conditions plummet. And why? Not because there's too little, but because there's too much. Now, Marx actually explained this beautifully in the Communist Manifesto, where he said the following, and I'll quote Marx again, where he said, in these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce. And I think these are actually quite, marvelous words to be, uttered 170 years ago. Because this is precisely the situation we find ourselves in again today in 2020. We are again in the midst of an economic collapse. Food is being thrown out, milk dumped into oceans, furniture destroyed, oil and timber burnt away, clothes torn, shoes thrown, all because workers cannot afford them. This is also why actually capacity utilization has trended downwards ever since the 1960s and today stands at around 75%. But again, that figure is a pre-COVID statistic. The levels are probably far below that at present. But again, what this capacity utilization means is that we're not even currently using the productive forces that already exist, that on average, around 25% of our productive capacity remains idle, only because the capitalists cannot find profitable markets to sell to. That if the workers cannot afford what already exists, why make more? You see, this is the twisted thinking of the bourgeoisie. And another thing the bourgeois told us was that this 2008 and 9 crisis was to be a once in a lifetime event. And now 10 years later, we find ourselves in another, deeper, more catastrophic capitalist crisis. Economists predict that this one will be even deeper than the last. In fact, it will be deeper than the Great Depression of the 1930s. However, if we take a look in the capitalist-owned media and press, we hear a different story. That these crises are not built into the system by any means. That's what they tell us. What they tell us also is that this disruption and this misery and this waste has been caused exclusively by COVID-19, by the coronavirus. But this couldn't be farther from the truth, because what is true, however, is that COVID-19 has been a sort of great revealer. Like when, for example, in The Wizard of Oz, the curtain has been lifted for all to see behind it. Similarly, this pandemic has lifted that curtain and people are beginning to draw radical conclusions from what they see. And what has been the role of media in this? They sing along in a frantic chorus Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Pay no attention. They don't want us to see what is lying nakedly before our eyes. But again, what are the facts? Far before anyone knew what a coronavirus is, far before COVID-19 was around, economists were predicting a deep slump. There were numerous reports stating that a crisis was due in the year 2020 or 2021. These reports came out as early as 2017 and 2018. That even in Canada, there were reports on the slowing down of our economy, the shutting down of small businesses, the laying off of industrial workers, as well as rock bottom interest rates, all before the coronavirus. And why wouldn't another crisis occur? Over the last 10 years, in every country around the world, the same conditions that brought about the 2008 crash were present and preparing for a deeper, more devastating crash. And here it is in 2020. That we have to remember that the capitalists didn't solve the 2008 crisis, that they simply delayed a new one. And how did they delay this? It was through massive injections of credit into the pockets of workers. Now, what this does is only temporarily extends the natural limit of the market. It extends the buying power of the working class only for a brief moment. And why is that? Because credit must be paid back and then with interest. And where are the workers to get more money? More credit? Well, that's no solution. But it's the only solution that the so-called intelligent capitalist economists have been able to muster up. That and printing money, which is also equally absurd and utopian. Again, the point is that capitalism cannot overcome this contradiction. These crises are part and parcel of the system. All that was necessary was a simple shock to send the global economy spiraling. That COVID-19 proved to be that shock. It was that accident that expressed underlying necessity. And the economy once again came down like a house of cards. Now, prior to the pandemic and the subsequent economic meltdown, statistics showed that over half, 53% of Canadians were already living paycheck to paycheck. And 1 in 4, 25%, said that their debt load was overwhelming. Now, Forbes in the States found that 78% of American workers were living paycheck to paycheck. This is in 2020. Now, given the further deterioration of the situation this year, with mass unemployment, layoffs, the general economic disruption, and increased credit and debt burden, it is obvious that these figures are already outdated and the real situation is probably far worse. And that is the world we're currently living in. A world where progress has been turned into stagnation, where innovation has been turned into destruction. Capitalism has clearly outlived its usefulness. And just like with feudalism, capitalism has reached its productive capacity and can no longer take humanity forward as it once could. And just like with feudalism, capitalism is therefore destined to be overthrown so that humanity can advance once again. Now, I cannot elaborate much longer on this subject. In fact, we have an entire session dealing with economics on Wednesday, September 16. That's in 2 weeks at 7 p.m. again. So make sure you tune into that. It's a very important question that we have to be able to understand this current situation if we're able to change it. But the final point I will make on this point is that this historic task, the overthrow of capitalism and its replacement by a socialist society, Marx said would be the task of the world's working class. And why? Because it is only the working class that is independently able to run society. And how do I know this? It was because the working class is already doing it. Not a wheel turns, not a light shines without the working class. The only problem is that under capitalism, the ownership and control over the wealth of society, over the means of production in society, remain in the hands of a parasitic minority, the capitalist class. Marx said that the workers must take hold of political and economic power, that the system they would create would naturally be democratically controlled and owned by the class as a whole. And once private ownership in the means of production and distribution had been abolished, with it too, the destructive crises of capitalist overproduction would also be eliminated. Because you have to remember that this overproduction is uniquely a capitalist phenomena, that in no other society have you had such an absurdity of a crisis of too much stuff. You see, a democratically planned economy, democratically planned production and distribution, not for profit, but on the basis of human need, would put an end to this wastefulness of capitalism. Unemployment would be abolished by rationally allocating labor. The workday would be reduced by new technology rather than new technology leading to layoffs, technological displacement, as they call it, under capitalism. That for the first time, human beings would be able to move beyond an animal existence that we're currently afforded under capitalism. And for the first time, we would be able to live as human beings. Now, Aristotle said 2,300 years ago that people begin to philosophize when the needs of life are provided for. Now, this profound statement by this philosopher of antiquity is a perfect exposition of historical materialism. A social society would free the productive forces under capitalism so that the world's population would have their most basic needs met, so that they can begin to develop themselves, their knowledge, their culture, music, art, poetry, science, their ability to philosophize, to think. But a social society requires an advanced industrial basis upon which it can build itself. In other words, socialism will be built upon the productive forces developed under capitalism. You see, the great German philosopher also once said something in relation to this, well, rather in relation to slave society. He said that it wasn't so much from slave society, but through it that humanity was freed. That slave labor allowed for the development of the sciences and technology, which would ultimately allow humanity to free itself from class oppression altogether. Now, similarly, we can say that it is not from capitalism, but through capitalism that humanity will be freed, because capitalism has laid the material basis upon which socialism will be built. Now, forgive me if I'm getting a little too philosophical, but speaking of Hegel, I have to mention that Marxism is also a philosophy. Marx himself, before he was a political man, before he dabbled in economics and in history, he was first and foremost a philosopher, a young Hegelian for that matter. He ultimately broke from Hegel's school of thought and developed it actually further than Hegel ever could. But in doing so, Marx created a revolutionary philosophy that would be the greatest tool in the fight for the liberation of the working class for generations to come, and indeed to this day. This philosophy of Marxism we today call dialectical materialism. Now, unfortunately, I have no time to do it justice today, but a few words must be said nonetheless. You see, Marx's philosophy was three things. First, it recognized that everything that existed was part of the material world and all life the product of the evolution of matter. Thus, he made no room for superstition, for mysticism, and other religious illusions and creation myths that were popular at the time and actually still are popular. You see, some of these are getting more popular as the crisis of capitalism deepens. But secondly, his philosophy understood change, contradiction, and motion in matter. This means that unlike all these other historians and economists and philosophers of his time, Marx was able to view nature, society, and human ideas as constant processes. That this materialist philosophy, combined with an understanding of motion and change, allowed dialectical materialism to be an incredibly dangerous philosophy, you see. That because finally, Marx also maintained that his philosophy was a philosophy of action. Unlike all others who simply attempted to understand the world, Marx maintained that the point was to change it. A philosophy of revolutionary action. That is what dialectical materialism is, in short. That it was only by being firmly rooted in such a consistent and revolutionary world outlook that Marx was able to make such great discoveries in the field of economics and then history. And thus, Marx's philosophy remains to this day our most reliable tool, not only to understand, but to overthrow the capitalist system. But you see, when confronted with such a great task on a global scale, that of the revolutionary transformation of society, the overthrow of capitalism, you see, many people are in fact being radicalized and they're joining the ranks of revolution. But there is a minority, I'd like to believe, of these others who are falling into pessimism and demoralization. And you see, I'd like to momentarily address that crowd. At the end of every dead end socioeconomic system, there has been a rise of cults, self-flagellant sects, for example, after the collapse of Rome, superstition, doomsday preaching, and all manner of pessimism and demoralized nonsense. Today's version of this is hedonism or nihilism. Now, let's be clear, there is not a single progressive aspect to this stuff. These are the luxuries of a dying social and economic class, the capitalist class, which has nothing to look forward to, as it is precisely them that have brought humanity to such an impasse, to such hopelessness. But you see, the working class is the only revolutionary force on this planet and should have quite another approach altogether. That far from an end, this is only the beginning of the history of our class. We have a world to win, a society to transform, and everything to look forward to. We are a revolutionary class and our tasks are great. We have no time to afford to pessimism or nihilism. We have work to do, incredible amounts of work to do. This means that we need to adopt a revolutionary outlook, a revolutionary philosophy. That only such a view of the world can allow us to contextualize ourselves, to draw out perspectives, and to optimistically intervene in the processes of history and come out victorious. That is the point, ultimately, to win. But on this question of victory, I want to briefly reiterate a point I made at the beginning. And I will conclude on this point, in fact, because if there's one thing I want people to take away from today is this, that Marxists do not make revolutions. The conditions of life under capitalism makes revolution. But to win, these revolutions require an understanding of history, past revolutionary struggles, revolutionary tactics, and perspectives for working class power. And once again, this is where Marxism comes in, because Marxism is a science of revolution. Marxism is the collective memory of the working class struggle. What is required for the victory of socialism on a world scale is an educated and experienced Marxist leadership in every last country in the world. A Marxist leadership that can fill the political vacuum that exists in our labor movements and lead the working class to power. That is what's required to win the revolution once and for all. Again, look at Chile, look at Lebanon, look at France. Can anyone say that these people don't want a revolution? Can anyone argue that there isn't the energy for a revolution? I would even say that there's enough energy in these working classes for 10 revolutions in each and every country on this planet. But no, energy and initiative are not the missing factors. What is missing is revolutionary leadership. As a great leader of the Russian Revolution, Leon Trotsky said, the historic crisis of humanity is the crisis of revolutionary leadership. And we do not have the time to waste in building it. That we're dealing with an economic crisis, plummeting standards of living, imperial wars, ecological devastation, and all manners of horror without end. You know, in Rosa Luxemburg's marvelous words, that the choice facing humanity today is socialism or barbarism. That if the working class fails to lead society out of this capitalist impasse, they can very well occur the utter destruction of civilization, as occurred after the fall of ancient Rome. So if you agree with what you've heard today, know that it simply isn't enough to agree, that we don't need mere agreement, we need revolutionary fighters. That recall what Marx said, the point isn't only to understand, but it's to change the world. Look, ideas are not sufficient. Leadership and organization is also required, and apparatus is needed. This is what allows us to bring these profound ideas into the working class, to arm it with the only ideas that can bring it to power and rid the world of capitalism. So I appeal to you, join us, join the International Marxist Tendency today. We are the only revolutionary organization that is growing, that is based firmly on Marxism, that is building a Marxist wing in the working class and student movements across the world. We're the only Marxist international organization that has such a broad scope, operating in 40 countries. Actually, recently we held a historic meeting of 6,400 revolutionaries with supporters attending from over 116 countries. That you can see the opportunities that exist are being tapped into by the IMT today. That we're organizing workers in Russia, Nigeria, Pakistan, all across Europe, in South America, all across North America, and many more countries. Of course, here in Canada, we are the single largest Marxist organization that is operating. Now, while we have been able to build the organization to this point, we cannot go further unless every one of you joins our ranks and helps us in building the forces of Marxism so that we can carry out the historic tasks of the working class. That I would say that there's never been a better time to be alive and be a revolutionary. This is a fight of our lifetimes. So join us today because we have a world to win. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hermes, for that fantastic introduction to the topic. So now we'll be moving into the discussion. And I encourage everyone, especially for those that this is your first Fight Back event, to ask any questions, clarification, make comments, and even disagreements if you have them. So just a few things before we move into the discussion. So please make sure to turn on your camera if you want to speak. So we want to make this as close to a real event as possible, and being able to see everyone's face when they speak is a part of that. And also it helps us mitigate trolls if there are any. And on that note, if you're just going to speak to be disruptive, and to be a troll, we will mute you and kick you out. So just heads up. So to be able to participate, you can raise your hand as a raise hand function on the right column. And so just raise your hand up. I'll put you on the speakers list. And with that, we'll get it kicked off. Okay, I see Marissa has her hand up. So I will unmute you, Marissa, and then you can go.
Hi, thanks for that excellent lead off, Hermes. I thought it was a great introduction. I was just kind of hoping that I wouldn't be first, but here we go anyway. I just wanted to come in on another part of Marxist, very spooky lighting. I just wanted to come in on another aspect of Marx's conception of history that I think is often misunderstood, and then that is the role of class and class struggle. Often you see people referring to class as if it's just an income category, or if the working class, it only consists of like white blue collar men working in factories with hammers and stuff like that. But class is something quite different from that. Marxists have a scientific conception of it. In fact, the first, at one point in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels write that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. It's one of the defining features of human society that drives things forward. And what class is, simply, it's a relationship of one group of people to the means of production, to how things are produced in society, how that society keeps itself alive. And you look back through history, you see people have had different ways of doing this, whether it was through owning actual people who produce things, or to owning the land, or today to owning, what we call the means of production, the factories, communications, transportation, things like that. And what defines capitalism is different from everything else, is that you have one group of people who owns things and another group of people who owns nothing but their own ability to work, and they have to sell their ability to work in order to live. So, changing that system, or changing your place in that system, it's not simply a question of, oh, anyone can start their own business. Or, everyone has an opportunity to be upwardly mobile under capitalism. It's like, no, these things need to exist for capitalism to function. And therefore, to change things, we need to change which class controls the means of production. And that is at heart what a revolution is. It's like, who has the real power in society, which is power to control how things are produced, how our labor is used, and how our wealth is put to use. So yeah, and as Hermes mentioned, today it's the working class that has the ability to actually change it, because right now the working class, they're the ones who actually produce things, and it's just a matter of taking it into our own hands, out of the hands of the capitalists. So just wanted to make that point.
Awesome. Thanks, Marissa. So before we go to the next speaker, just to let everyone know, in case you're having trouble raising your hand, you do have to click on the participants tab, and that'll give you then the option to raise your hand. So next, I have Rob J. So if you can please make sure that your video is on, I will unmute you. You can go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. For really interesting intro to the subject. Really appreciate it. I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail about some of the specific factors that led to the last round of revolutions, and what maybe can be taken away from that. What can we learn from the way the capitalist revolutions happened, to find out, to view how history will play out from now, and what we can expect, and maybe how we can influence that.
Thanks, Rob. So next, we have Mitch. If you're good to go, Mitch, I'll let you get unmuted.
Oh, am I unmuted? Yeah, okay, cool. I had to accept the unmuting, which I thought was kind of funny. Anyways, yeah, well, thank you for that very much. It's actually kind of relating to the previous question. I just kind of like to outline what made Marx unique within the general tradition of the left, right? Of the radical left, that it is a historical truth that as long as there have been poor people, they've generally been unhappy about it. Even if their accounts weren't written down. You go back far enough to Spartacus in ancient Rome. There's a very good movie about it, and a bunch of really bad TV shows. What is unique about Marx was how it wasn't just that he took the side of the poor and the oppressed, and he very much did, of course, right? But he studied the history and the material means, and how it was that capitalism creates these conditions, and how it is that the poor can win from the history of class struggle, right? That it isn't enough to understand that oppression exists. It's about studying that oppression, understanding the trajectory of fighting against that oppression, so that we can learn the lessons of the past. And in all of Marx's most important writings, you find quite a thorough historical account of all the past struggles of the class, not merely an endless number of statistics in terms of how capitalism works. I think in terms of, indeed, Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto at a time when there was already a small communist movement existing in Europe. And he intervened to try to clarify its ideas and place it within the tradition of the broader workers' movement, which dominates a lot of the most interesting sections of Chapter 1 of the Communist Manifesto. I'd encourage anyone who hasn't read that to pick it up, which is obviously available at our bookstore, and I'm sure that there will be a link posted in the chat. And this is important, that the conditions that previously, prior to the development of capitalism, there were attempts to bring about a classless society, right? Particularly, there were advanced means in the fight against the monarchies, in what we call the bourgeois revolutions, the English Revolution, the French Revolution. But they controlled no wealth in a lot of cases. They were dispossessed peasants. They were poor people. In some cases, they were artisans, right? They couldn't see anything beyond forming communal gardens, which were stomped on, and they were beaten and driven out, right? That all they could really aspire to do, Marx, right, was to make poverty genuine, while the means of wealth was in the hands of the capitalist class, who, after having played almost no role in bringing down the monarchies and defeating feudalism, came in over the heads of the movement, and became the dominant class, that put the poor back in chains after they dealt with the landlords, in many cases. The basis for socialism, unlike the defeats of those movements of the poor and oppressed previously, is that the creation of the working class, which had to be trained in running the machines and running the industry, not only meant that it now has the possibility of controlling wealth, that, as we say, now the wheel turns, now a light bulb shines without the permission of the working class, but that also it produced such an abundance that that we could live in a society without scarcity absolutely. And that right is denied to us by the needs of profit, by the needs of feeding this parasitic ruling class. There's actually just an article in the news today that while you have massively advanced means of producing food, huge numbers of foodstuffs that sit in fields and rot every year. You hear reports in the European Union, you have subsidized crops, which are turned into giant oceans of cereals, of food products that rot at the same time that this particular year, they're estimating something like 1/10 of the world's population face the threat of starvation. Right? That there's enormous means of producing wealth, and yet the global working class is denied this wealth. And this is really where you get the contradiction that lays the basis for success. That you have more and more people who not only are trained in fighting, but it becomes more and more clear that a better world is possible by taking the wealth that we produced and using it for our own ends, of seizing the wealth we make and developing it according to ourselves, because we know how to run these things better, and that is that's really I think an important distinction, and it's one that Marx makes very clear in the Communist Manifesto. And it's also how the power of the working class increases, no matter despite the fact that organizationally the working class might be weaker, particularly in the advanced capitalist countries, than it has been previously. Trade unions have suffered recent defeats. Mass parties of labor are quite pathetic at the moment, but the wealth and the power that the working class globally controls has never been higher. And it is engendered with all the lessons of the past, provided we can study those lessons, as Marx committed his life to doing, and also actively intervening and bringing those lessons to working class people through his life up until his death. So, anyways, that's, and I think that is the essence of Marxism. It's a study of the past and an active intervention to on the side of those fighting to change society, to help them win ultimately. So, that. And thank you for the reaffirms.
Okay, thank you, Mitch. So next I have Lily, and then after that I have Sarah. So please make sure that you just put your camera on before you start speaking. That'll help us. So Lily, if you want to go for it. And I encourage everyone to, even if you have a small question, please speak up and raise your hand. So go for it, Lily.
Hi. So may I make a comment about the statue that John A. MacDonald fought? So this Saturday, we have seen that in Toronto and Montreal, there are mass movement against racism, and as John A. MacDonald's statue was fallen off, but I found there are some very unfriendly voice from a website called 51.ca. This is a website that Chinese people owned in Canada, and I found that those journalists, they most likely to defend John A. Macdonald and against protesters. But they forget that he was very responsible for the Chinese Exclusion Act, and a lot of Chinese people had died or severely injured in when they are repairing the railway. So also I would like to tell those journalists that please read the history carefully and to understand why John A. Macdonald's statue are fallen, and only we who joined the movement knows that we are having a socialist revolution, and we want our world to be better. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. Okay, next is Sarah. So I'll unmute you, Sarah, if you're good to go.
Hi, I had kind of a question. So my experience with communism is I lived in Russia for 6.5 years, not during the Soviet Union, obviously, I'm not that old, but during Putin. But it was really interesting to sort of get an impression of some of the myths that we hear, like that communism completely failed and things like that. I didn't feel like that was true at all. It seemed like economically, actually, people like in the 80s were doing really, really well. People had disposable income. There wasn't a lot of products because of Western interference. But what I guess I have trouble reconciling and I'm trying to learn more about is obviously Stalin scares people, yeah. But also just the idea of how would you run a communist system that could be sustainable without interference from capitalists, without sort of that vanguard idea that I think that's the right word. Again, I'm learning. And not being like they were. I mean, there were a lot of issues that were like really that dictatorship. I didn't like that part. I'm assuming most people don't. So I'm just curious, like how do you guys see that? Are there ideas about that?
Thanks, Sarah. So next, I'll pass it over to Jenna. If you're good to go, Jenna, and please have your camera on. So I'll unmute you here.
Hi there. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Hermes. That was really good. I really enjoyed that. So I just have a question. You mentioned like kind of like a second Red Scare. My question is, how can we kind of support each other as comrades against things like attacks against our own beliefs? And like, how can we kind of counteract that? And like, kind of, how can we respond when things happen, like when people say things like that?
Thanks, Jenna. And thank you to everyone so far for the contributions. And I hope that, everyone's seen the importance of theory and are excited to read more. So normally we would actually have an in-person table for all of our literature, our books and booklets. Obviously, we're not able to do that, but we do have an online bookstore that I just wanted to mention. So there you can find classics like Lenin's State and Revolution, Trotsky's Fascism, What It Is and How to Fight It. So I encourage everyone to check out our online bookstore. The link will be posted in the chat here, and you can also just go to marxist.ca/store and you can be able to check that out. Okay, we'll continue on with the discussion. And next I have Moxie and then Rishi. So yeah, please make sure to just put your camera on before you speak. So I'll unmute Moxie if I can find.
I got it, yeah. Well, thank you very much, Hermes, and thank you for all the contributions. Lots of questions on the floor, and I don't want to take up more time than I have to. So I just want to speak very quickly on oppression, because I think it's one of the most burning questions of our society at the moment. We're seeing the massive movement of Black Lives Matter. We're also seeing concentration camps at the US border, massive wars imperialist wars, genocide in Yemen, funded by Canadian military apparatuses. And of course, it's not even to go into the various oppressions of religious minorities, gender minorities around the world. And as Marxists, we have to understand how this oppression comes about. It's not just that people are bad. Oppression is not inherent in society, nor is it inherent in any section of society. Rather, what we have to understand is oppression is rooted in the needs of the society that we live in, and the forms of oppression change according to the society's needs. At one point, Lily mentioned, it was Chinese immigrants who were vilified, attacked, and sent to camps. There was Japanese, or at one point it was the Irish, and then of course you have the legacy of indigenous genocide and chattel slavery, which lives with us today. And at all these points, these weren't accidents. These were the needs of the system. The chattel slavery was necessary to the capitalist system to produce the cotton and the other cash crops in order to fuel the Industrial Revolution. Indigenous genocide was necessary to the colonizers in order to profit off of the land, to drive the people off the land there. And what we understand these are is there are so many different forms of oppression which exist today. And the mechanisms of the oppression, the ways oppression is experienced are vastly different and all require their own particular way of addressing them. But there's a commonality that we can address as Marxists, and that is that these divisions in society are sowed by the capitalists because it's profitable. It is profitable to keep women in the home doing unpaid work so that workers work longer, so that this work isn't paid. It is profitable to the capitalists to constantly betray indigenous land rights and titles so that they can build pipelines. This is enforced by the state. And ultimately, this gets to the heart of the question. The state is a mechanism of oppression. It is a mechanism of oppression of all workers. And as Marxists, what we understand is that the ruling class, the capitalists who own everything, are the ones profiting off of this division. There is no other form to understand the widespread persistence and legacy of oppression, other than the fact that this is very useful to those on top. Because if the working class were to unify and realize that our greater enemy isn't each other, but is the capitalists, we would all be united in the fight against the capitalists, and then we can go to a socialist society where we would have the tools to start undoing the decades and centuries of oppression. Because these things won't be resolved overnight after a socialist revolution. Socialist revolution is not a train that you get on and wait for oppression to be over. Revolution is a process. And that process is one that the workers have to take hold of, take charge of, and collectively, under a planned economy, can start undoing the centuries of damage, many forms of oppression, war, imperialism, and colonialism have caused to our society, and caused, more importantly, to the peoples who are the victims of those forms of oppression. And so I'll leave it with this. I don't want to take up too much more time. But the Marxist method gives us the clearest answer to how to fight oppression. It gives us the clearest mechanism of its origins, and it gives us the best mechanism, best tool to wage war against all forms of racism, homophobia, and transphobia. And that is socialist revolution and a worker state where we can have the tools to undo the legacy of oppression.
Awesome. Thank you, Moxie. So next on the list, I have Rishi. So Rishi, if you're good, I will unmute you, and please make sure that your camera is on.
I just wanted to say very much agree with Moxie on the thing that it's all a part of the system and how this system has developed with all direction oppression against the workers. And I think a very good thing that I took from Marxism like Marxist theory is that his concept of dialectics, like how he explains like in stages how the society transformed from like one system to the other. So we had the feudal system, and if at that point like people were trying to introduce a socialist revolution, I don't think that was possible because majority of the workers were not even involved in the majority of the economy. So at that point, I think a bourgeois revolution was apt at that situation. But through dialectics, like I think the society has transformed in a way just for capitalism to succeed that they're really minority in terms of numbers, these capitalists, but they have a lot of control over political control, a lot of money, and the majority of the people are just workers. So they have a lot of control over the people, but they don't really have a lot of control over the means of production. So I think right now it's under the workers' control, and we have the conditions for a workers' revolution because like everything that's being produced is the knowledge is with the workers, right? Like everything is controlled by the workers. It's only the capitalists only know how to uh, uh, move the puppets here and there and move the sticks. So yeah, so that's I think it's a good part of the theory.
Thank you, Rishi. So next we have Fraser. So Fraser, if you're good to go, I will unmute you here.
Right. Thanks. Sorry, I'm a bit new to this whole thing, so I might get the term slightly wrong. There's a question, not sure if it's the right format for that. So lately it seems like there's been a bit of a blurring of class lines with like small businesses, Uber, the gig economy, all that stuff. Workers don't really look the same as they used to, and they're now more than ever partially or fully owning the means of their own production. Does Marxism needs to be amended or changed entirely in order to fit this? Or if not, how does it accommodate for these new classes of people? Thanks.
Oops, sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Fraser, for that comment. So next is Alejandro. If you're good, I will unmute you and just make sure your video is on, please.
Is that working?
I think it's working now. Yep, we can see you if you want to go.
All right. Okay. Sorry, I'm not used to speaking out loud, so if I confuse my words, get nervous. I'm sorry about that. But I just want to raise awareness of a thing that a lot of people who don't really know much of Marxism or leftist ideologies say that it has never worked. But the problem that I find is that it has worked in so many different places, just that we, or at least Western people, don't hear about it. Like, for example, my background is from Colombia and Guatemala, mixed with African and Mayan. And within Guatemala, we had a civil war that they like to say started in the 1960s, but it started way before that, and it's still going on now. And the indigenous people, you know, the way that they live their life is very similar to the Marxist ideology. And we had one of the earliest presidents elected for being socialist, getting closer to Marxism. And within that short amount of time, the country was doing so much better. There was less crime, there was more progress and everything. But every time that, you know, a smaller country starts to get development through leftist ideals, they get shut down by the bigger Western countries, especially the United States, who started the whole Civil War and tried to bring everyone down. And they always send these people called economic assassins to go and destroy the infrastructure, the economy of a country that's prospering without capitalism. So whenever people, I just want to say that whenever people say that Marxism doesn't work or leftist ideals don't work, please like do the due diligence of looking into smaller countries that have tried but have been shut down by the bigger countries, because I feel like no one talks about the times of when it works, that they only focus on, you know, China or Russia, but there's so many other examples of it working and unfortunately getting shut down. We need to, you know, keep these other countries and these other times in mind that it has worked. And yeah, that's about as much as I have to say. Sorry if it didn't make sense.
No, that was great. Thank you, Alejandro. So I will take I have a whole list of speakers. If you want to get on the list, please raise your hand now because the list is already quite long. So next, I have Elise Shirley. So if you're good to go, Elise, I will unmute you, and yeah, please make sure your camera is on.
Hi, I'm pretty new to this as well, so excuse any, like, I don't know, I guess redundancy. I missed the first 15 minutes, but I just have a few thoughts about this cycle of capitalism that we've been in for hundreds of years and the brainwashing that we're all under. Maybe not this specific group of people, because as it's very evident, we're taking steps of trying to undo it. But I think a lot about the rest of the people and like family members and friends who just are complacent and who don't really either believe or think it'll work, or just maybe don't even really care to make those steps forward. And how I know that times are changing, but it seems impossible. And I say seems because I know that it isn't, but I just think about how capitalism owns everything except for your freedom sometimes, and then but you have to sell that to live. And I've kind of been stuck on that, and how do you beat that cycle? Sorry. It's been a long time and there's lots of unlearning to do as well. And I think it'd be cool to touch upon how deeply rooted capitalist ideals are in your individual, like the ways that you think about yourself. Like I've been doing a lot of work in therapy about how I have this incessant need to constantly be working on something, and how that isn't really natural and how it's not bad. It's just capitalism trains you to always feel the need to be working on something. And I think it'd be interesting if you guys maybe focused on undoing capitalist thought processes in your personal life that can also help, you know, show other people that it's this huge revolution, but it's also can take place in smaller personal ways of, you know, showing that like, okay, capitalism is actually it's plaguing us, and it's this virus that's infecting everybody, but here are some ways that, you know, undoing it actually personally can help you. I feel very guarded about my own personal beliefs, so joining this kind of public group is very nerve-wracking and scary. And but I know that, you know, the viewpoints line up, and I feel guarded but hopeful. And before I stop talking, I just wanted to thank, I don't know the speaker's name, but because I came in late, but that was a really good, lots of good words, lots of good ideas, and it was a good introduction. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Elise. So I have myself next on the list, and then that'll be followed by Kyle and then John. So just a heads up to make sure that your video is on for when you want to speak. So I think the connected to the question around what is Marxism is the question of revolution, and do we even need revolution? I think many lefts and even so-called socialists will say that we don't need a revolution, actually, that there's a third path, a different path between austerity and revolution, and that's the path of reforms. This idea that we can actually reform the system, that we can fix it, is very attractive, because that means that we don't have to do the hard work of actually having a revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, but that we can work within this system day to day, winning reforms, and we will end up in a better society after all. But unfortunately, the real test for ideas is not whether we like them or not. The real test for ideas is if they can be proven correct or incorrect under the hammer blow of events. And I think that the events we're living through right now, this crisis of capitalism, has also revealed the utter failure of the ideas of reformism. I think one of the best examples of the failure of reformism was the election of Syriza about 5 years ago in Greece. This party was created out of the huge wave of social unrest, revolt, and strikes against a brutal austerity package that was pushed onto the youth and workers of Greece by the EU, by the IMF, in the wake of the 2008 financial crash. And Syriza put itself forward as a progressive left anti-austerity, even anti-capitalist party, in their own words, of course. And however, when they came to power, we saw that they only used this mass movement, these strikes, they saw it simply as a bargaining chip to be able to bargain with the capitalists, to lower that austerity package that was being shoved down their throat. But unfortunately, there was no bargaining to be done. There was no middle ground to be found. They had a choice before them. The capitalists were unwilling to shift, and the choice before them was either to break with capitalism or to break the workers. And they completely capitulated to the capitalist class of the EU, and ultimately actually delivered the biggest austerity package, even worse than the preceding conservative government in Greece. Now, this betrayal of reformism does stem from its ideology, from its shortcoming as its misunderstanding of the nature of capitalism. In refusing to break with the capitalist system, they ultimately had to operate within the limitations of the society, of capitalism and class society. And ultimately, Syriza, this very progressive party, became the ultimate defender of capitalism. In fact, one of the leading members of Syriza even said the role of that party was to save the capitalists from themselves. And it's even more ironic when we think, that how our reforms actually won. In every revolution in history, there's always been a situation where the ruling class, the capitalist class, will hand down reforms from above to prevent revolution from below, to really prevent this inevitable revolution that is pushing itself forward. So you see, it's not because of some bargaining, it's not because of some lobbying. It was out of revolutionary waves that those reforms are even won. And right now, in the midst, I would say, of economic and a social catastrophe where millions have lost their job, thousands have lost their lives, what is practical right now? The reforms, so-called, that can be won are none. What we're having is a claw back. There are counter reforms being pushed onto us. There's no wage increases, there's no increase of social services. In fact, what we're seeing is social services being cut and the police forces increasing, right? And so I think that we have to understand we can't define our program and our movement by what is possible and practical under capitalism. And actually, the masses have shown us this, especially in the States, but in the struggle for day-to-day reforms, we've seen the masses use revolutionary methods like strikes, occupation, formation of defense committees. It's our job to give this revolutionary instinct of the masses a revolutionary program. And that is the Marxist program, I think, that can rid the problems that people face once and for all. That's it for me. So yeah, next I had Kyle. So Kyle, if you're good to go, I will unmute you.
Hi, comrades. It's been a brilliant discussion so far. I just wanted to bring up one of the speakers earlier had a question about, state repression and the Red Scare and things like that. And I think, and they ask, well, how do we protect ourselves against this? Like, what do we do? And what I would say is that it's what we're doing right now. You know, it's building, you know, a cadre organization that allows, you know, all of us to be, you know, capable revolutionaries that can, you know, if one of our number is arrested or falls, we can carry on with the work. I think, you know, the phrase is something like, and I'm probably getting this slightly wrong, but it's something like you can, you know, a real cadre, you can parachute into the middle of a new place and they would be able to build a branch within a year or something like that. You know, and we're kind of fortunate here, you know, in the West, in the U.S. and in Canada, that we're not living, you know, in such times where state repression is like an everyday problem, like it is in other places, and then like of course how it was in, you know, for the Bolsheviks in you know, in Russia prior to the revolution. You know, by the time, you know, the 1905 revolution came around, like most of the leaders of the Bolshevik party and a lot of the RSDLP members in general had been in exile before, had been in prison and jail. And then after the 1905 revolution, like the repression, you know, was ramped up significantly. You know, the Prime Minister Stolypin, you know, was famous for his Stolypin necktie, which of course was hanging. Like activists were hanged and executed, and repression was at an all-time high. But because of the, you know, the nature of the Bolshevik Party, because it was a cadre party, you know, people, you know, we were able to persevere. And of course, you know, the events of February and October proved it to be the correct method. So, you know, I understand that, you know, there's a lot of rhetoric. They can be scary, you know, like, you know, the recent events in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and activists being killed. Like it's frightening, but if we stick together and if we, you know, become cadre, you know, eventually we're gonna have a revolution and we're gonna win it. So yeah, I'll leave my comments there.
Okay, thank you. So next I have John. So John, if you're good to go, 1 second, I will unmute you here. Where are you?
That's great. Thank you very much, Hermes. That was a very clear and helpful presentation. And I find the questions and the comments from the floor very encouragingly thoughtful, passionate, and highly informed. So it's been a thoroughly enjoyable experience. I've been reflecting recently on the difficulty of trying to encourage others, particularly through means of persuasion, to create and to engage in revolutionary forms of thinking and activity. The way the system embeds itself pedagogically through ideology constitutes a really seriously deep formation. And that, of course, is why the culture critique of the Frankfurt School operated in order to examine and to explain the way in which the system embeds itself in the popular imagination. But I wonder if, as a result, that there is something in the capacity of the category of Marx on alienation, which is actually very helpful of a way of explaining to a largely hedonistic culture, or at least a thoroughly self-interested and self-involved culture, about the nature of capitalism's reduction of all things to the objects of capital. So that's my broad and general comment and question. And just before I go, just one encouragement, Hermes, for a bit more care and hesitancy is over your use of postmodernism. I think there's a danger there of taking a rather mythical textbook version of it. It's highly complex, and there are multiple forms of Marxist conversation that are actually going on in there with the likes of Foucault and post-structuralists like Derrida and so on. It's more interesting. But thank you very much.
Thank you, John. So next, I'll have Brian. So Brian, if you're good, I'll unmute you.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the question asked earlier about the gig economy and the self-employed economy, and whether Marx's ideas can still be used with this creation of, I guess, this new thing. I guess we could start with like Uber drivers. Sure, they own their own car, but they're still selling their labor. They're still selling their labor to Uber. And food deliverers from like Skip Dishes or I don't know what else is out there, but yeah, they're still selling their labor. We can't forget what makes a class in a capitalist society. And I think Marx's ideas about class and, sorry, we can't forget that it's not a matter of the money that one person is making, but or like an individual's perception of their role in society that makes someone working class or bourgeoisie, right? It's their relationship with the means of production and the state, right? It's whether they're selling their labor or they own the means of production. And I don't think Marx's ideas have lost any, I guess, what's the word? Any value or importance because of a creation of a new, like a new market, I guess, right? So yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Brian. So for the sake of time, I will just ask people to keep their interventions to 3 minutes max, if you can. So next, I had Maral. If you're good to go, Maral, I'll unmute you.
Okay, hi. So I was just going to come in on this idea of human nature, because I think it's something that we hear a lot as Marxists, that socialism cannot work because human nature is greedy. So I want to just really briefly address that because it's something we hear really, really often. And it's because people have this very static way of looking at the world, right? That if the world exists in a certain way today, that's how it's always been. And if you look around the world today, it seems like a lot of people are greedy. I would argue that even right now, working class people are not greedy. Like there's all of these multi-billion-dollar charities that get all of their money from very poor working class people who want to help other slightly more poor working class people. But you could say that it's a system that runs on greed, that we live in a system that rewards greed. But if you look historically, for most of human history, we did not actually have inequality. So the human race, Homo sapiens sapiens, is 200,000 years old. And for the first 190,000 years of our history, so for 95% of our existence, there was no inequality. We all lived collectively. There was no state, there was no oppression. Men and women were equal to each other. There was no racism. Everybody lived communally. It is actually the fact that humans are able to collectively cooperate with each other that sets us apart from the animal kingdom. It is the reason that we were able to develop things like abstract thought and language, because we are such a cooperative species. This system of inequality, oppression, different classes, exploitation, it's only 10,000 years old. So when people talk about human nature, it's really because they're ignorant. They haven't studied their history. And a lot of these people will accuse us of not studying history. But this is a very basic fact that you learn in first-year biology classes, first-year anthropology classes. It's a very important piece of knowledge, I think, for us to have and to explain. That for most of human history, we were able to live collectively, and that human nature is fluid, right? It changes as the material conditions change. Our ideas change as our material conditions change. And that what we want to do is go back to a system where human beings are existing cooperatively, where we're all working together to democratically own and run production. That's what Marxists are fighting for, is a democratic running of society, a democracy that's much deeper than what we have today. The most thorough form of democracy possible under capitalism is parliamentary democracy, like we have in Canada. You vote for some asshole once every 4 years, and you don't see him again until the next election. They make a bunch of promises and they don't carry through. What we're talking about is grassroots democracy, every workplace being able to elect delegates from on the shop floor, right? The leaders of the factory being people that are elected from among the workers themselves, people that can be recalled at any time, people who do not make any more than a worker's wage. That's the system that we're fighting for, and it's totally within our reach. One argument of this human nature that comes up is that Stalinism prevailed because of human nature. And Sarah, you asked earlier about Stalinism, dictatorship, how do we address that? So I would recommend that you come to the future talks that are happening in the school. There's going to be one on, was the Soviet Union socialist? And there's going to be another talk on the history of Trotskyism. So these are both talks that will definitely go into that topic. And there's also this book that we recommend all of our members read. I had it here a second ago, but it's The Revolution Betrayed. So this is a book that Trotsky wrote, essentially explaining everything that was happening in the Soviet Union, all of the processes taking place. And to summarize it really briefly, bureaucracy thrives whenever the working class is not politically active. Not just in the Soviet Union, but even in the NDP today, in the trade unions today. If you go to the meetings, they are run very bureaucratically. It's very boring, and it's very hard to get a word in. And they do that way on purpose because they want workers to not participate. And then when workers don't participate, they strangle democracy even more. The only way to fight bureaucracy in all of its forms is through workers' participation. And in the Soviet Union, there was very thorough workers' participation. That's how the revolution was even possible in the first place. The workers were very actively participating politically. That's how they were able to overthrow Tsardom and accomplish a workers' state. But then why did they retreat from politics and a bureaucracy was able to thrive? To give you the very short answer, the revolution was supposed to spread internationally and it didn't. When the revolutions in other countries, to be more accurate, it spread, but in the other countries for different reasons, mainly the fault of the leadership of the other socialist parties in other countries and communist parties, it failed. When the revolution remained isolated to Russia, which was a very economically backwards country, that was never the plan. The plan was always international revolution. So when it remained isolated, there's two problems. First of all, there's an issue of morale. The workers are very disappointed. Every time they see a revolution in another country, it's led to defeat. That's very demoralizing, and they need that inspiration to keep participating politically. And another part of it is resources. This was the most backwards country in Europe. They had almost as many steel plows as wood plows. 10% of the population could read and write. Less than 1% had electricity or plumbing. Right? No country in the world is that backwards today. Even the most backwards country in the world today is 10 times more efficient than Russia was at that time. So during this period, the people, they're starving, they're working long hours because of the material conditions. It's very difficult for them to be politically active in those conditions, especially when they're demoralized by the failures in the rest of the world. It's under those very unique conditions that the working class retreated from politics enough that a bureaucracy was able to take over the state apparatus and essentially make sure that the workers would never be able to take power again. But if you look at the conditions around the world today, in order to prevent that, there's two things we can do. One of them is to build a very strong international so that next time there's a successful socialist revolution in one country, it's not the only country where we have a strong section. There's strong sections in other countries. So our comrades, if we are successful in Canada, for example, we have comrades in the US that will follow our lead, or if they're successful, we'll follow their lead. Right? So we have a very strong international. Fight Back is not just a Canadian organization. We are part of the international Marxist tendency. We have sections in over 25 countries. And the second part of it is that today, the objective conditions are much better. Like I said earlier, Russia was a very economically backwards country that could survive. The democracy could only survive for so many years in isolation. Today, the productive forces are so much more advanced, even in the most backwards countries. In Canada today, the average worker creates $40 of value per hour of labor, but the average wage is $22. And I'm pretty sure most of us here make less than $22 an hour, right? So you can clearly see that the wealth is there for a democratic worker state in Canada and in the rest of the world.
Okay, great. Thank you, Maral. So next, I think I have Mirage. If you're ready to go and have your video on, I can unmute you here.
Hi, I have two questions uh, to hear the answer so that I can improve my understanding in Marxism as well as to gain more confidence in Marxism. The first question is that why Marxist theory is very important for our revolution. Because see, for example, for the Dutch freedom struggle or famous French Revolution or American independence war or Italian unification or German unification, when bourgeoisie waged a struggle against feudalism, the leaders did not develop any comprehensive theory actually. Of course, here and there were books or articles, but like Marxism, a philosophy, economic theory, or a critique on previous economic system, they did not develop. Why we need at this particular era in the anti-capitalist revolution, we need a theory? That's the first question. And the second question is, which is the major driving force which changes from a system to another system? Is it the productive forces, means science and technology, or more factories, or is it the trade and commerce? Because the speaker comrade told that after the fall of Roman Empire, there was a reduction in trade and commerce, and which pushed that Europe into dark age for a long time. So, but there was flourishing trade in Middle East, Arabian world, but they failed to develop into capitalism. And if you take the case of India and China, in the pre-capitalist time, they were the major contributors of world GDP. There, it was maturing, and their productive forces were maturing actually that time. Historically, if you compare to Europe and America that time, but still they failed to move into capitalism. So, what are the basic forces? And if we take the case of capitalism now, both the trade and commerce is widespread, as well as productive forces are improving actually. Even we have now artificial intelligence, a huge research on that actually. So, but so what is actually the forces which is driving, creating new classes, creating to new class conflict, which is the driving a society to move from one stage to another? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So next I have Marco. Marco, where are you? Go for it.
Thanks, Renu, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I think all of the comments have done a really excellent job explaining the ideas of Marxism. I wanted to tackle a more basic question, which is this one of, well, why do we even need a philosophy? And more specifically, why does the working class require a philosophy in its struggle and in its development? Now, the fact is that everyone, whether they know it or not, has a philosophy. That's just a simple fact. And of course, when I say philosophy, I don't mean you have a degree in the Greek classics. But when I say that, I mean that you have a specific way, a certain way of looking at the world. And everyone certainly has a certain way of looking at the world. Now, there are some people who claim to have no philosophy, or they say they reject meta-narratives. In fact, they'll even go so far as to say that to have a philosophy or to have an overarching explanation that is subjective, which I think is even more ridiculous, frankly. But there's a problem here, is that ideas don't exist in a vacuum. And very often what ends up happening, that when you claim to have no philosophy, you end up unconsciously adopting the ideas of the ruling class. There's an old Marx quote where he says that the prevailing ideas in any epoch are those of the ruling class. And you see this with these types. I think most clearly, as I think Hermes explained, with the postmodernist academics and academic Marxists and all these types of individuals. And yes, John made the point that there are all types of postmodernists, and of course you can't all lump them into one category. You know, there's also many different types of Oreos. So there's birthday cake Oreos, there's vanilla Oreos, there's the regular Oreos. But at the end of the day, there's one Oreo cookie. And when we're looking at different philosophies, we have to ask, what's the underlying trend that gives it its definitive features? And I would argue that with postmodernism, which has become very much in vogue in academia lately, not in the working class, by the way. Working class has no semblance of an understanding of postmodernism, and thank God for that, I would say. But the overarching idea, I would argue, is this attempt to sort of find a middle way between capitalist beliefs and what they call orthodox Marxism. And I consider myself an orthodox Marxist, and Fight Back considered itself an orthodox Marxist organization because I think the ideas are good. So I have no problem calling myself that. But it attempts to find a middle way in between the two, essentially. But what's interesting is that with many of these academics, in fact, they spend the bulk of their time not attacking the capitalists, not attacking capitalism, but in fact, the bulk of their time is spent attacking the Marxists, attacking the basics that make Marxism Marxism. And in fact, they share two of the most important ideas with the ruling class. And that is the belief that revolution is essentially not possible, at least not in the way that Marx envisioned it, and that unity in the working class is not possible, or else it's too difficult to be possible in our lifetime, which again is an idea that Marxists thoroughly reject. But then there are other people who say, well, I just don't want a label. I don't want to sort of ascribe myself to any one school, any one philosophy. In other words, they don't want to accept that one theory is definitively correct or mostly correct. But I can guarantee you that all of these people who view things in this way, and it's a very common view from quite honest people, I guarantee you that during this pandemic, they wear masks, they social distance, they wash their hands, and they avoid large gatherings, which is to say they accept a meta-narrative. They accept an overarching view of society. And you know what that is? It's epidemiology, the study of disease. But that's also a belief. That's also a theory. That's also a science, a way of understanding the world. And I would say a very good one because of its proven reliability to work. And in fact, anyone who rejects that is rightly rejected as a charlatan. In fact, they're the ones putting society at danger by rejecting views which have been proven to be correct. But of course, if you take the rejection of all philosophy, say, I don't want to adhere to this label, I don't want to adhere to any labels, that's the logical conclusion. In fact, I would argue that it's these anti-maskers who are the most consistent postmodernists that we have today, because they reject meta-narratives more than anybody. But the fact is, like Hermes said, if you can accept that laws exist in chemistry, in physics, in all of these science, and you should remember that when we talk about science, it wasn't always called science. You know what it was called before that? It was called natural philosophy. It also began with study, with theories, just like any modern science today. And the fact is, if we can accept that laws exist in all these fields, then why on earth can't we accept that they can also then apply to human society? That you can't find laws in human society, that there's some kind of artificial barrier that separates the natural world from humanity, which is a product of that natural world. And of course, why do we accept theory? Because of its proven reliability to work and its proven reliability to predict things accurately and allow people to direct their attention and direct their energies to the most successful avenues of work. And that comes to the question of, well, why Marxism? Again, because of its proven reliability. If it's text like the Communist Manifesto, which was written over 150 years ago, I think you'll find that it's actually a very modern text, in that many of the things that Marx described over 150 years ago have borne true today. You know, the growing inequality, the ruin of the middle class, the sort of growing tentacles of capitalism that stretch the globe. All of this was predicted. And Marx was ridiculed at the time, by the way. But that's what we mean by proven reliability and ability to predict. And that's why I believe Marxism is a powerful theory. So I would say if you accept these ideas, then you are a Marxist. In fact, I would go so far as to say you're an orthodox Marxist. You accept the basic premises of what Marx had to say, and you shouldn't shy away from calling yourself a Marxist. And not only that, but if you agree with these ideas, you're beholden to act on them. It's the same with a scientist. If he were to discover some sort of theory that was able to cure some horrific human, that scientist would be beholden on taking those theories to the public, to the scientific community, in order to rid humanity of these ills. And I think it would be the same. I say it would be the same for Marxists. So if you accept these ideas, if you agree with these ideas, I would encourage you to join the IMT, join Fight Back, which in my humble opinion is the only organization in Canada today that is fighting to bring these ideas, the genuine ideas of Marxism, to fruition and help us overthrow capitalism once and for all.
Thank you, Marco. So next is Sergey. So if you can please just make sure your video is on, then we can let you go. Okay, I will unmute you.
Okay, so I just want to do several notices. First of all, history of 20th century show for us two ways, because capitalism has contradiction and they cannot be solved by capitalism. And usually capitalism makes WWX to resolve it. It's a final stage. So I believe this fight back, all we are here, can stop it, and we can really prevent something terrible which can happen. It happened before, but it also was some catalyzation of the WW for revolution in Russia, and more socialistic countries appear on the earth after WW2. We don't need to afraid it. Also, I want to refer that I was born in USSR. My childhood was in the 90s. I saw how people were changed with new system, with capitalism. And it was terrible. People became more atomized and really ignorant and arrogant. And they started to ignore each other. They started to be more greedy. It was not like this at the end of the 80s. I mean, USSR made a long way like to this point when it was disassembled from the top, and it was many reasons, and it's a big history. I don't want to say like everything was fine there, but it's definitely was better, and it was something new, and it was alternative to capitalistic development of the world. So I'm really happy to see so many people here in Canada are interested in socialism, and I think we will come to success. I just wanted to say, capitalism also did not become in one day. It was some time, like 100 years, when capitalistic revolution happens in different countries, and it was rolled back to feudalism, and another feudalistic country had intervention into the new capitalistic countries because it was more progressive and better. It provides better opportunities for people. We are in a time of socialistic revolutions now, and I really believe that we need to agitate and spread our word of orthodox Marxism, as a lot of people say here. This will prevent, as I said already, WW, and it will provide prosperity for people. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. So the last speaker will be Joel. So 1 second, I will unmute you, Joel.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, my name is Joel. I'm an activist with Fight Back in Montreal. And I wanted to respond to something that was asked kind of at the beginning about if there's kind of a new Red Scare of sorts, as Hermes referred to. Everyone's denouncing communism these days, just like back in Marx's day. Well, I guess that kind of ties in very well to the topic of the discussion, and a general theme is like, is Marxism still relevant? Well, it obviously isn't, because if you listen to the school, what's taught in schools, you listen to you read in the papers, you listen to what politicians and big capitalists say, academics all tell you that it's not relevant anymore. It's old ideas. They don't, they're not relevant. They don't explain the situation. And that's why, and this is what the whole, if you want to call it a new Red Scare or whatever, is saying the same thing. No, that's just dictatorship. Millions of people die. It's a big problem, But the question is, I think calling it a Red Scare is actually good because they are scared. Actually, that's what's occurring. That I don't think that billionaires just spend millions of dollars and spend all the time and energy, and Donald Trump goes out of his way to denounce Marxism. He sees it everywhere, not just Donald Trump, politicians of all sorts. I don't think they spend all this time and money to attack something that isn't relevant. They don't spend all this money to attack something that is dead. I think they're precisely attacking Marxism because it is relevant and because actually they're scared of it. And they're scared of it because it actually helps people to explain the world. Now, for a long time, it did seem, for decades, at least in a country like Canada or the United States, it did seem like Marxism for most people didn't make any sense, right? Soviet Union fell. That was a mess. The capitalism's pretty good. You can have a decent life. You have a middle class. You have a house. You can send your kids to school. You have an okay job. What are you complaining about? Capitalism is the best system, obviously. You're talking about a revolution. The working class. Are you kidding me? Most of the working class votes Republican or Democrat. They vote for the capitalists. Like, they don't support socialism. They don't support Marxism. A crisis of capitalism? Are you insane? We hadn't seen that for so long. Most people would consider this silly for a long period of time. But now things have turned into their opposite. And actually, that's actually a profound conclusion. That's actually a profound philosophical conclusion of Marxism, that things don't change gradually. They change with a bang. Fundamental change happens with a bang. You have quantitative buildup that then erupts into a qualitative change, which is precisely what we're seeing now. This is exactly what Marx talked about. He said that there'll be periods in relative stability, and then you'll have a punctuated period of revolutionary crisis brought on by economic crisis that is hardwired into the capitalist system. And so capitalism helps us explain, Marxism helps us explain, and you even read it in the Communist Manifesto, a relatively short document you should read if you haven't already. Mass globalization, how capitalism is going to nestle everywhere, how it's more progressive in terms of the development of technique and the productive forces than all the other systems, but that in doing so, in developing the productive forces, it creates its own gravediggers in the modern proletariat. And that's what we're seeing today, is that all these people that maybe 10, 20 years ago would have been supporting the capitalists and now realize that the system is completely useless. You see it bleeding through every pore of our society. It's leading to a dead end. And I think that's why Marxism, that's why they're attacking Marxism. That's why there's a Red Scare. And I don't think we need to be, I've kind of sort of avoided the question about what we can do about it. I don't think we need to be too worried about that. We do need to support each other. And the best support is unity, is that we unite together, we support each other, and we build a force in the movement that's strong, that's organized, and that unapologetically defends Marxist ideas. And actually to think that they're doing this not out of strength, actually. They're doing this out of weakness. They're doing this because they're actually scared that working class people, that the material conditions for most working class people and young people under capitalism are not good. And if you go to them and tell them that capitalism is amazing, like they do in the press in the US, and politicians do that, they say, oh, it's amazing, America's awesome, capitalism is great. They look at the material reality and it doesn't match up. So this has never been a better time to be a socialist. It's never been a better time to be a Marxist. I know lots of people are on the call here. I hope people get involved, because I think we have historically a great opportunity to provide an alternative for humanity. I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you, Joel. So I think that's the last of our speakers. And so with that, I will pass it back to Hermes to conclude. If you're good to go, Hermes.
Yep. Thanks, Serena. Yeah, again, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today. Thank everybody for staying this late as well. I think it was a fantastic discussion. There was a very variety of points raised, good questions asked. Now, obviously, I can't hit on every one of them. They're very good questions. Keep coming out to our meetings. Join our organization. We have plenty of time to discuss in depth all of these different questions. But I will touch on a few that I think are worth mentioning, worth reiterating as well. I think, Rob, you asked a good question about how we can draw the lessons out of these experiences, these different revolutions to guide our struggle today. I think actually, I'm not sure if I misunderstood the question, but I think it's a simple answer that how we draw the lessons is that we need to study these different revolutions. What happened in Paris during the Paris Commune? What happened in the Russian Revolution, in Germany, in China, in Spain? Read on these revolutions, study the weaknesses, the strengths, the reason that they failed, the reasons that they succeeded, and on that basis, arm ourselves with the correct tactics and orientation for today's movement. That in doing so, in studying these, experiences, we've outlined, at least I tried to outline in this presentation, one of the key ideas that ultimately, one of the key factors missing in these revolutionary movements that failed is revolutionary leadership. Now, why were the Russians successful in 1917? It's because they had a Bolshevik party that was prepared for a revolution, that had trained up a whole generation of young workers, students, in the art of revolution, to expect a revolution, and when it came, to be able to take power. And that's precisely what was missing, we can say, in all of these other revolutions in the 20th century that failed to take power. But again, that's precisely what we're trying to build today, a Bolshevik party in every country in the world, including in Canada, so that when these revolutions, when these movements do pick up, we can take them to their logical conclusion. And I think this connects well, the notion of this Bolshevik party, to Sarah's question of how we can build a social society without it degenerating. Now, Maral already covered this. I will say a few points on this that, the term vanguard, I don't think we should be afraid of it. Because, a less, scary way to put it is leadership. And I see nobody's scared of that word, because leadership is a fact of life. That, when some people to come to a certain conclusion before others, they're naturally the leaders in that given sphere. In the case of determining that capitalism is outdated and we need a new society, people come to that conclusion who organize to build an apparatus that can take these ideas into the masses of the working class. Well, they can be considered the leadership. So again, I don't think we should be afraid of that. Actually, we should welcome it, because what you saw was that leadership was precisely the question that determine whether or not the Russian Revolution would be successful. That if you look back at the history of the Soviet Union, the setting up of the workers' state by the Bolshevik Party was actually the most democratic state in the history of human society. That it was controlled and run by the working class through what they called their Soviets, workers' councils. That there was no more a democratic system than that which existed in the Soviet Union in its early years, from 1917 to, you could say, 1924, 1925, and essentially the mid-20s. What changed ultimately, and I think Maral covered this very well, is that left in isolation, the Soviet Union was unable to build a social society, because what you need to build a social society is, on the one hand, an industrial basis, an industrial capitalist basis. And on the second hand, you need a working class that is educated and that is capable of assuming power and taking control of society, of organizing society. In Russia, obviously, we know that it was a semi-feudal country. It was living in conditions of backwardsness, with a very small working class. After the World War I, after the Civil War in Russia, this working class was further whittled away. And so you essentially had a vacuum. And in that vacuum came in the Soviet bureaucracy, came in this monstrous bureaucracy that choked out this workers' democracy that did indeed exist Now, at that time, when the bureaucracy was beginning to take power, when the revolution was beginning to degenerate, you had the left opposition led by Leon Trotsky, one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, who fought to reinstill workers' democracy, who fought for world revolution, for internationalism. Now, we have a session on Trotskyism, what it is. We have a session on whether or not the Soviet Union was socialist and why it degenerated. Again, I think these are respectively on October 7 and 14. So please tune into these events. They will answer your questions in depth. But I think I will leave it there for now. But one last thing I will add on this question is that if you look at society today, you look at how advanced technology and industry has got, you look at how educated and large and numeric the working class is on a global scale, essentially the material conditions exist to build a healthy social state with workers' democracy so that there isn't any longer a need for such a bureaucracy to take control. But I mean, this question of, Soviet backwardsness, I think also connects to Fraser's point about Uber, about Fedora, about gig economy. Because actually, if you look back at Marx's writings, he predicted that the revolution would break out in France, in Germany, in Britain, that it would happen in these advanced capitalist countries. But where did it occur initially? Well, we know it was Russia. It was a backwards, a Tsarist Russia that the revolution broke out. Now, back then, there were actually people who didn't fully, carefully read Marx, who then began to panic. Oh, do we have to revise Marx? Do we have to revise Marx? Well, ultimately, Marxism is not a dogma. It is a method. And Marx wasn't a crystal ball gazer. He didn't predict how the future would turn out. He developed a method through which he understood how to understand and analyze society. So that was Marx's method, and that's a method we need to be able to utilize and understand and apply it to our society today, rather than take quotations and try to apply them to reality today. No, we have to use the method. Marxism is above all a method. And so, in relation to our Uber drivers and our Foodora drivers, are they capitalists? Well, I think if you consider the fact that they are the most exploited in the labor force today, it's quite clearly points to the fact that no, indeed, they're not capitalists. Sure, they own their cars, but psychologically, you can see that they're absolutely workers, that they have every single interest in common with the working class, and hence they're workers. When they go into struggle against their corporations, against these monstrous exploitative companies like Uber and Foodora, what methods do they use? Well, they use working class methods. They go on strike, they unionize. What is Uber doing today? Well, they're currently caught up in a legal battle to essentially change the characterization of their workers from self-employed to workers. Now, you see, if we fall into this illusion that the workers are capitalists, it's essentially us falling into the trap that has been set by these corporations, through which they exploit and isolate Uber workers and Foodora workers by labeling them as self-employed or quasi-capitalists who set their own hours and such. But no, that's precisely the opposite of what these workers need. They need our support and our solidarity. They need working class solidarity, and they need to be invited into the labor movement as fellow workers, rather than continue to peddle this nonsense of them somehow being capitalists. But there's a couple articles on Marxist.com on the gig economy that you can feel free to check out for more depth. Now, in terms of very quickly dealing with Miraj's question, that I think it's just a confusion of terms, really, Miraj. That I think when we're talking about the need for theory, it's quite simple that to change the world, you need to be able to understand what we're changing and why we're changing it. That, how are we going to convince people of the merit of our cause unless we explain to them why we believe that we need such change? And what else is this if not theory? I think really that's quite simple. And in terms of the productive forces, the development of the productive forces as a source of development versus commerce and trade as a source of development. Once again, I think it's just a confusion of terms that, the trade and commerce are simply means of exchange and distribution of the products that are developed by the productive forces, that you can't have one without the other, but ultimately you can't be trading things, that commerce can't exist if there is not the productive forces present to produce the commodities that are being traded and that are being exchanged on that market. So again, you can't remove one from the other, but again, primary are the productive forces. I think, I hope that helps in that understanding. But again, I'd like to end on the point that there's no substitute for reading, that we have to revisit these ideas and study them and build that method as our own method so we can begin to analyze the world in this framework with this Marxist lens. And I hope I did justice to some of these key ideas of Marxism today. I hope people took away something valuable. I don't really have much of a rousing ending for this half. I kind of exhausted myself in the first. So in short, I will appeal once again, though, for people to join the IMT, to join Fight Back, to get organized. The quickest way to learn is to be organized, is to discuss regularly with your comrades. Now, you might be hesitant, oh, I'm not sure if I'm a Marxist, I'm not sure if I fully agree. Well, even if you partially agree, come discuss with us, because that's, again, the best way to see where you stand. And if you do find out that you agree, well, then get organized, help us build the revolutionary organization that we need, that the working class needs to put an end to capitalism once and for all. And with that being said, thank you for your time once again. Back to you, Reinu.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hermes. That was fantastic. And everyone else as well, thank you for attending and making contributions. So just to update everybody on what's coming up, tomorrow actually we're having yet another event in our Marxist University series. So this one will be on Mountain Time for West Coasters. So it's going to be on the Communist Manifesto. You can make sure to check out our Facebook page that we have for the university for the full schedule of what's coming up. We'll post a link to that in the chat so everyone can check that out. Our next event that's going to be happening on Eastern Time is next Thursday, discussing abolishing the police and the Marxist assessment of the state. Should be a really exciting event. Hope to see everyone come out to that. And also make sure to share our events and promotion, spread the word to your family, your friends, your co-workers, and get them active in the struggle for socialism. When you do post about the university, I'd encourage you to use the hashtag Canadian Marxist University. That would be great. And also, don't forget to check out our subscription to the magazine and support independent workers' press that's fighting to spread socialist ideas and build a revolutionary organization here in Canada. So if you haven't already checked that out, please check that out. The link was shared in the chat earlier, but you can go to marxist.ca to subscribe. And actually, we are doing both physical papers as well. So if you like having something to read physically, we are mailing out our magazines now, so you can get those on a monthly basis. And finally, so normally we would continue the discussion at a pub, given that there was so much to talk about, and I'm sure there's so many other points to be made, but obviously we can't do that. However, we are going to be doing a kind of virtual pub. So I really encourage everyone, if you want to continue the discussion, to stick around. We'll be breaking out into smaller rooms and we'll be chatting then. And if you can't stick around, but you do want to get active, please be sure to connect with us through Facebook, social media, and email, and get active, as everyone said, in the fight for socialism. So with that, thank you, everyone. And yeah, hang tight. We'll be breaking out into the rooms. Thanks, everybody.